Have you ever watched someone smile while silently falling apart inside? That is the tragedy of an empath, because empaths are not weak people. They are people who feel too much for too long without protection. And the most dangerous thing about repeatedly hurting an empath is this. At first they cry, then they overthink, then they blame themselves. But eventually, something inside them changes forever. Not loudly, not dramatically, silently. Like a light slowly dying in a room nobody notices anymore. An empath does not break in one moment. They break in layers. Every disappointment becomes another crack. Every betrayal becomes another sleepless night. Every harsh word becomes another wound they pretend doesn't hurt. Because empaths are experts at hiding pain, they will comfort others while secretly drowning themselves. They will ask if you are okay while their own heart is collapsing. They will still give love even after being emotionally abandoned. But repeated pain creates something terrifying inside them. Emotional exhaustion. And most people never notice when it begins. At first, the empath becomes quieter, less expressive, less excited, less alive. Not because they stopped caring, but because caring started destroying them. You see, the empath mind is constantly absorbing emotional energy. Every lie, every manipulation, every cold response, every ignored message, every fake apology. They feel all of it deeply. What others forget in minutes, an empath replays for years. And that repeated emotional damage slowly rewires their inner world. They begin questioning themselves constantly. Am I too sensitive? Am I asking for too much? Why do I always end up hurt? Why do people change after I trust them? This is where the real damage begins. Not in the betrayal itself, but in the empath losing trust in their own heart. Because once a deeply loving person becomes afraid to love, something sacred has been destroyed. And the scary part is, most people only notice the empath after they change. After the warmth disappears, after the patience dies, after the emotional availability is gone. But nobody asks what caused that transformation. Nobody talks about the hundreds of nights they spent crying silently. Nobody talks about the emotional abuse they normalized. Nobody talks about how many times they forgave things that shattered them internally. Empaths are often emotionally trained by pain. They learn early that love means sacrifice. That understanding others is more important than protecting themselves. That staying soft is somehow noble, even when the world keeps cutting them open. And because of this, empaths attract emotionally unavailable people more than anyone else. Why? Because wounded people are drawn toward emotional light. The empath listens. The empath understands. The empath stays, even when they should leave. And slowly they begin carrying emotional burdens that were never theirs. The problem is, an empath can survive pain, but they cannot survive endless emotional disappointment without changing psychologically. Eventually, their nervous system enters survival mode. Now they stop trusting kindness. They overanalyze affection. They become hyper-aware of tone changes, facial expressions, energy shifts. One small change in your behavior, and their mind begins preparing for abandonment. That is what repeated hurt does internally. It turns peace into anxiety. It turns love into fear. It turns emotional safety into emotional survival. And many empaths begin disconnecting from themselves without realizing it. They stop expressing needs, stop asking for reassurance, stop speaking when something hurts. Why? Because experience taught them that vulnerability often leads to rejection. So instead of communicating pain, they bury it deep until the body itself starts carrying emotional trauma, sleepless nights, mental exhaustion, emotional numbness, random sadness, overthinking, detachment. People think the empath became cold. The empath became tired. There is a massive difference. A cold person does not care. A tired empath cared too much for too long. And eventually their emotional system overloads. That is why some empaths suddenly disappear. No explanation. No drama. No revenge. They simply reach a psychological limit. A moment where their soul quietly says, I cannot survive another disappointment. And once they reach that point, they stop fighting for connections. Not because the connection was meaningless, but because losing themselves became more painful than losing people. This is the hidden psychological truth nobody talks about. Repeated emotional pain forces empaths into emotional self-protection. The loving person becomes distant. The patient person becomes guarded. The emotional person becomes numb. Not naturally, but as survival. And honestly, this transformation is heartbreaking, because deep down the empath still wants love. They still want honesty. Still want emotional safety. Still want genuine connection. But now fear stands at the door of their heart. Every time someone gets close, their past whispers, be careful. And this creates inner conflict. Part of them wants to trust. Another part remembers what trust did to them before. So they become emotionally divided. smiling outside, battling internally. And this battle becomes exhausting. Some empaths begin isolating themselves completely, not because they hate people, but because peace feels safer than attachment. Silence feels safer than disappointment. Distance feels safer than betrayal. And many people misunderstand this phase. They think the empath is antisocial, arrogant, emotionally unavailable. But the truth is much darker. The empath is emotionally injured. There is a reason wounded empaths become emotionally unreadable, because they learned that showing pain attracts more pain. So now they hide everything, even heartbreak, especially heartbreak. But here is the most dangerous part of repeatedly hurting an empath. One day, they stop reacting. No arguing. No emotional speeches. No begging. No explaining. That is when the connection is truly dying. Because when an empath still reacts emotionally, it means they still care. But when they become emotionally silent, it usually means something inside them is already detached. And detachment in an empath is terrifyingly final. Because empaths do not leave impulsively. They leave after mentally grieving the relationship 1,000 times. By the time they walk away physically, emotionally they have already buried the connection inside themselves. This is why many people become shocked afterward. How did they move on so fast? They did not move on fast. You simply ignored the slow death happening inside them for months, maybe years. Repeated hurt changes the empath's relationship with love itself. Now they question motives, question intentions, question vulnerability. Even genuine love can scare them. Because trauma teaches the nervous system that emotional closeness equals emotional danger. And sadly, many empaths begin attracting toxic cycles because pain became emotionally familiar. Chaos feels normal. Emotional inconsistency feels expected. Bare minimum affection feels valuable. Why? Because repeated hurt lowered their emotional standards while increasing their emotional tolerance for suffering. That is why healing becomes essential. Not just emotionally, but psychologically. And empath must relearn something the world destroyed inside them. That their sensitivity is not weakness. It is intelligence. Their emotional depth is not a curse. It is awareness. But awareness without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And this is the lesson many empaths learn too late. You cannot keep setting yourself on fire to keep emotionally cold people warm. At some point, you must choose yourself. And for many empaths, this becomes the hardest decision of their lives, because they were conditioned to save others before saving themselves, to understand others before understanding their own wounds, to forgive others before protecting their own peace. But healing begins when the empath finally asks, "Who heals me?" That question changes everything. Because now the empath starts realizing something painful. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to their heart. Not everyone deserves explanations. Not everyone deserves another chance. Not everyone deserves the soft version of them. Boundaries become necessary. Distance becomes necessary. Self-respect becomes necessary. And slowly, the empath begins rebuilding themselves. Not into a colder person, but into a wiser one. A person who still loves deeply, but no longer ignores red flags. A person who still cares, but no longer abandons themselves for others. A person who still feels intensely, but finally understands emotional protection. And this new version of the empath is powerful, because now they understand human behavior differently. They recognize manipulation faster, recognize emotional inconsistency faster, recognize fake affection faster. Pain sharpened their intuition. But unfortunately, that wisdom came through suffering. And perhaps the saddest reality is this: many people only value the empath after destroying them. After the warmth disappears, after the loyalty ends, after the emotional availability dies, suddenly they miss the person who always cared, always listened, always forgave, always stayed. But by then, the empath may already be emotionally gone. You see, repeatedly hurting an empath creates two versions of them. The old version, soft, trusting, endlessly patient. And the new version, careful, guarded, emotionally selective. The world usually meets the second version after breaking the first one. And honestly, that transformation did not happen because the empath wanted revenge. It happened because survival demanded change. No human being can absorb endless emotional pain without adapting psychologically. Eventually, the soul protects itself, even if that protection looks like distance, silence, coldness, detachment. But deep inside, most empaths still mourn who they used to be. The version of themselves that loved fearlessly, trusted naturally, gave openly. Because trauma changes emotional innocence forever. Still, there is hope. A healed empath becomes one of the strongest people you will ever meet. Why? Because they know pain deeply, yet still choose kindness. They know betrayal deeply, yet still choose honesty. They know heartbreak deeply, yet still choose love carefully. That is strength, real strength, not emotional suppression, not pretending not to care. but surviving emotional darkness without becoming cruel. And if you are an empath listening to this, remember something important. Your heart was never the problem. The problem was giving unlimited love to people who only knew how to take from you. Stop apologizing for feeling deeply. In a cold world, emotional depth is rare, but your sensitivity needs protection, not shame. You were never meant to carry everyone's emotional weight while ignoring your own wounds. And healing begins the moment you stop begging people to treat you with basic emotional respect. The moment you stop chasing people who keep emotionally starving you. The moment you understand this powerful truth. Losing people is painful, but losing yourself trying to keep people is far more dangerous. So protect your peace. Protect your energy. Protect your heart. Because once an empath finally reaches emotional exhaustion, the version of them that loved without limits may never fully return again. And the most painful part? Most empaths never realize they are emotionally dying until they can no longer recognize themselves. One day they wake up, and the person in the mirror feels unfamiliar. The laughter sounds forced. The conversations feel empty. The heart feels tired before the day even begins. Because repeated emotional pain does not only hurt the mind, it changes identity. Slowly, quietly, dangerously. An empath who was once full of warmth begins operating on emotional survival instinct. Now they analyze everything, every delayed reply, every change in tone, every moment of distance. Their nervous system becomes addicted to scanning for danger because experience taught them something terrifying. Pain usually comes after attachment. This is why wounded empaths often struggle to relax emotionally. Even during peaceful moments, part of their mind remains alert, waiting, preparing, expecting disappointment. And that constant emotional hypervigilance becomes exhausting. It drains joy from relationships. It drains trust from connection. It drains peace from everyday life. Because internally, the empath is fighting battles nobody else can see. A war between hope and fear. Hope says, maybe this person is different. Fear whispers, they will hurt you too. And after repeated heartbreak, fear usually comes louder. This is how emotional trauma reshapes an empath internally. Not through one catastrophic event, but through repeated emotional wounds that slowly convince them they are unsafe in love. And eventually, the empath stops expressing emotional needs altogether. Not because they no longer have needs, but because disappointment trained them to expect neglect. So instead of asking for reassurance, they stay silent. Instead of expressing hurt, they minimize it. Instead of confronting problems, they emotionally withdraw. This creates a dangerous internal pattern. The empath becomes emotionally independent in unhealthy ways. They convince themselves, I do not need anyone. But deep down, that is not empowerment. That is protection after emotional starvation. There is a huge difference. A healthy person enjoys solitude. A wounded empath hides in it. And many empaths become masters of emotional masking. They can smile while collapsing internally, encourage others while secretly feeling empty, appear calm while mentally overthinking everything. Why? Because they spent years becoming emotionally available for everyone else, while nobody became emotionally safe for them. That imbalance destroys people slowly, especially empaths, because empaths naturally absorb emotional atmospheres. Walk them into a room filled with tension, and they feel it immediately. Place them around emotionally manipulative people, and eventually their nervous system becomes overwhelmed. That is why toxic relationships affect empaths differently. What others recover from in weeks, an empath may carry emotionally for years, not because they are weak, but because emotional experiences penetrate deeper inside them. Words stay longer, memories stay longer, pain stays longer, and repeated emotional pain creates emotional fatigue that most people never understand. This fatigue is not normal tiredness. It is soul exhaustion, the kind where a person no longer has energy to explain how hurt they are, the kind where silence becomes easier than communication, the kind where isolation feels emotionally safer than connection. And honestly, this is the stage where many empaths disappear emotionally from the world. Not physically, emotionally. They stop sharing themselves completely. Now conversations become surface level. Now vulnerability disappears. Now emotional walls become permanent. People say, you changed, but they never ask, what happened to you? Because behind every emotionally distant empath, there is usually a history of repeated emotional betrayal, a history of giving too much to people who gave too little back. And perhaps one of the darkest things that happens internally when an empath is repeatedly hurt is emotional numbness. This is dangerous because empaths are naturally emotional beings. Feeling deeply is part of who they are. So when they begin feeling nothing, that means their emotional system has entered shutdown mode. They are no longer processing pain. Normally, they are surviving it. And emotional numbness can look calm from the outside, but internally, It feels like emptiness, no excitement, no emotional spark, no trust in happiness, just existing. Many wounded empaths begin questioning life itself during this phase. Not dramatically, silently. They wonder, will anyone ever love me correctly? Why do I always attract emotionally draining people? Why does caring deeply always end in suffering? And these questions slowly change how they see themselves. Repeated hurt often creates hidden shame inside empaths. They start believing they are too much, too emotional, too caring, too sensitive, too available. But the truth is, they were never too much for the right people. They were simply giving extraordinary emotional depth to emotionally immature individuals. And emotionally immature people often mistake genuine empathy for weakness. Until the empath finally leaves. Then suddenly they realize what they lost. But by then, the damage has already happened internally. Because every repeated betrayal teaches the empath another painful lesson about human nature. And eventually they stop expecting consistency from people altogether. This creates emotional loneliness even in crowded rooms. The empath becomes surrounded by people, yet emotionally disconnected from everyone. Because trust no longer feels natural. Trust now feels dangerous. And this is why some empaths become addicted to solitude after being repeatedly hurt. In solitude, nobody manipulates them. Nobody disappoints them. Nobody emotionally drains them. Peace becomes addictive after chaos. Silence becomes healing after emotional noise. And during this phase, many empaths begin rediscovering themselves, slowly, painfully, but powerfully. They start realizing how much of their life was spent emotionally overextending for people who never deserved that level of loyalty. They begin noticing how often they ignored intuition just to avoid losing people. How often they tolerated disrespect in the name of understanding. How often they abandoned themselves trying to keep relationships alive. And this realization hurts deeply, because the empath finally sees the truth. They were not only hurt by others, they were also hurting themselves by refusing to walk away sooner. That awareness changes everything. Now the empath becomes more selective, more protective, more intentional, not cold, just conscious. And this new awareness makes them emotionally dangerous in a different way. Because healed empaths stop begging for love. They stop chasing validation. Stop over-explaining their worth. Stop sacrificing peace to maintain toxic connections. Now they understand something powerful. Real love does not require emotional self-destruction. Real love feels safe, consistent, respectful, calm, not confusing, not manipulative, not emotionally exhausting. And once an empath experiences inner healing, their standards rise permanently. Now they would rather be alone than emotionally drained, rather walk away than beg for honesty, rather protect their peace than perform emotional labor for people who never reciprocate. This transformation shocks people, especially those who benefited from the empath's endless tolerance, because suddenly the empath says no. Suddenly they stop explaining themselves repeatedly. Stop tolerating disrespect. Stop reopening doors for people who keep hurting them. And people call this cold number. This is self-respect finally awakening. A healed empath understands that compassion without boundaries becomes self-abuse. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson repeated pain teaches them. You can love people deeply without allowing them unlimited access to your emotional well-being. That lesson changes their entire life. Now they protect their energy carefully. Because they finally understand something most people learn too late. Energy is life, and emotionally draining environments slowly destroy sensitive souls. So the empath becomes intentional about who they allow close. Not everyone deserves access anymore. Not everyone deserves explanations anymore. Not everyone deserves another opportunity to wound them. And honestly, that wisdom is earned through suffering. But despite everything, despite betrayal, despite emotional exhaustion, despite heartbreak, empaths still possess something rare. The ability to remain human in a world that constantly tries to harden them. That is their true power, not sensitivity alone, but surviving pain without losing the ability to love genuinely. And if an empath is listening right now, please remember this. Your kindness should never require self-sacrifice. Your empathy should never become permission for people to emotionally consume you. And your heart deserves the same love you constantly give to others. Stop shrinking your emotions to make emotionally unavailable people comfortable. Stop apologizing for needing honesty, effort, consistency, and respect. Those are not unrealistic expectations. Those are basic emotional needs. And one day, the right people will not punish you for feeling deeply. They will protect your softness instead of exploiting it. They will communicate instead of confuse you. Choose you.